The Zeon army is mostly known for their mobile suits, and for good reason.
モビルスーツの威力を前に連邦艦隊はただなすすべもなく撃破されていく。
But mobile suits weren't their only weapon. In fact, when Zeon first came to be, those 18-meter tall death machines were still nothing more than wishful thinking. For example, the Chive class wasn't even designed with mobile suits in mind. Instead, it was meant to carry the Gobble. And while it might be hard to imagine nowadays, these things were Zeon's main fighting force before the introduction of mobile suits. It was designed mainly as a fighter craft, but its heavy weaponry would also make it very capable in anti-ship combat. It had 6 built-in missile launchers on the wings, as well as 4 weapon bays there, which would typically be equipped with short-range missiles. On its body, it had 2 larger weapon bays, which would typically be equipped with larger anti-ship missiles, and 6 30mm Vulcan guns to deal with enemy fighters, which would mainly consist of the Federation's Toriaris and Saberfish space fighters. And according to the MSV standard book, it could also be equipped with an optional triple-barreled laser gun turret, although there is no footage of it, nor is it mentioned where this gun turret would be located. I'm guessing that it would be placed on one of the larger weapon bays on its body, if the mission would mainly be against enemy fighters and less so against enemy ships. And with so many weapons at its disposal, the Gobble would be piloted by 2 people, the pilot in the front and the flight officer in the back. Development began in the early UC-0060s, and by UC-0070, it was officially adopted and put into mass production. By the time the 1-year war rolled around, over 3,000 had been produced, and they would be in use throughout the entire Zeon fleet. The aforementioned Chibe class could carry 1 squadron, a Dolos class would carry 6, in addition to its 100 mobile suit complement, and they would also be used by the Guazin class and even the Musai class, a ship that nowadays is almost synonymous with the Zaku too. After the outbreak of the 1-year war though, it would of course be phased out in favor of mobile suits. But this wouldn't be the end of its service life, because it still had some important roles to play. It was still vital for defending fleets, freeing up mobile suits to join the front lines, and it was also used to deliver weapons and ammunition to those mobile suits on the front lines, something that it excelled at thanks to its large amount of weapon base. And it was even sometimes used to ferry mobile suits into battle, saving them the fuel to get there and extending their operational time. So despite being overshadowed by those later mobile suits, the Gobble was a powerful machine at the time of its conception, and it would continue to serve vital roles. As a result, it would also get some variations. Near the end of the war, a reconnaissance version is known to have existed, which has a radar mounted on its back, and it also served as the basis for another one of Zeon's main spacecraft, the Gattle. Whereas the Gobble was mainly a fighter, the Gattle was more of an anti-ship bomber, with an even greater focus on heavy firepower. It came packing with a total of 10 built-in missile launchers, 4 weapon bays for large anti-ship missiles, and 4 30mm Vulcan guns, with 2 underneath each cockpit. And talking about those cockpits, they had a very unique feature compared to any other space fighter of the time. The pilot and the co-pilot each had their own little cockpit ball thing, and this ball had its own set of thrusters, allowing it to function as a small escape craft. Unlike the Gobble though, we don't really have a lot of information on the development of the Gattle. We know that it was based on the Gobble, but we don't know when development began or when it was completed. Although, it is most likely that it began before mobile suits were being produced in earnest, as its intended role seems to overlap with the intended role of the Zaku too, taking out the Federation's big ships. the crux of their big gun doctrine that would really come back to bite them in the ass. But just as with the Gobble, when the 1-year war broke out, the Gattle would be playing second fiddle to Zeon's brand new mobile suits. But again, not without serving a purpose. In the early days of the war, they would serve to defend bases and act as kind of a buffer force. They would keep the enemy busy until a mobile suit squadron could intervene. But then by the end of the war, when things were getting increasingly dire for Zeon, they were again sent out to the front lines. While they are inferior to mobile suits in many aspects, these fighter bombers did have some things going for them. They were maneuverable, and they also had powerful engines. And it was exactly these powerful engines that would lead to the next machine that we'll be covering in this video, the Dra-C. After Zeon's defeat in the 1-year war, not all Zeon soldiers were equally willing to admit this defeat, and some even vowed to keep on fighting. They would splinter into many different groups, each with their own goals and ideals, but the one thing that all of these so-called Zeon remnants had in common was a lack of resources. So in order to bolster their forces, they would often have to make the most out of outdated and broken equipment. And one of these machines was the Dra-C, developed by a Zeon remnant group calling themselves the Lost Fleet. Although you could say that developed is somewhat of a liberal use of the term here, because despite its cool exterior, the Dra-C was in fact little more than an amalgamation of spare parts that were somehow coaxed into working together, with the main donors being two of Zeon's main machines, the Zaku 2 and the Gattle. And let's pause for a second here, because while it is pretty straightforward to see where the Zaku 2 is being used in the Dra-C, that's not really the case for the Gattle, because purely visually speaking, there's almost no similarities. But that is simply because we're looking at the wrong version of the Gattle. For Sentinel 0079, the Gattle got a bit of a facelift by Hajime Katoki, in the same way that the Jim and the Zaku 2 also got a facelift. But while they would later on be retconned as alternate versions, being the Jim Type C and the Zaku 2 F2 respectively, it seems that our Gattle just remained the Gattle. And when we turn this Gattle version Katoki on its head, we can suddenly see where the backpack of the Dra-C came from, with just some small stylistic changes. The two main thrusters became bigger, and the three sub-thrusters became smaller. But at least, we can tell that they're supposed to be the same thing. So now, let's look at where the other body parts of the Dra-C came from. The body and the arms came from a Zaku 2 F2, but the arm is replaced with a triple-barreled 40mm Vulcan gun, but there is also the possibility that some units kept both Zaku arms, so that they could use standard Zaku 2 weaponry for, of course, more firepower. The head then also came from a Zaku 2 F2, but was more extensively modified to give the Mono Eye a wider range of movement. The shoulders came from a worker spacecraft, and finally the legs are giant fuel tanks with thrusters that are supposedly also modified from something from the Gattle. Considering the Dra-C's backpack is the main body of the Gattle, I don't really see where these could have been, considering they're 3 times as long as the thing itself, so I guess they must have been very heavily modified. But regardless, these booster things did have some pros and cons for the Dra-C. On the one hand, they lowered its maneuverability because they were basically worthless for AMBAC, therefore placing its performance somewhere between a fighter and a standard mobile suit. But on the other hand, the legs of a mobile suit were its most maintenance-heavy parts, whereas these new boosters were as simple as they got, making the Dra-C very easy to maintain, and this is definitely something very important when you're a Zeon remnant working with a shoestring budget. And for offensive capabilities, other than the 40mm Vulcan gun, it also came with a shield that was scavenged from a battleship's armor, and inside of it, there was a beam saber. However, as you're probably very well aware, Zaku's couldn't use beam weaponry. So to drive this saber, a small generator, an E-cap, and a cooling unit were installed on the inside of the shield to drive this thing. Still, all of this didn't make for a particularly powerful machine, and most of these units would be used for either reconnaissance or as a diversion. Around 30 would be made, and most would be lost during the Lost conflict. But some of these units would go on to have surprisingly long service lives. Whatever units remained were picked up by Axis, repainted grey, and pushed into service during the Grips War. And even later during the Laplace conflict, slightly customized Dra-Cs would be used by the sleeves. They were now painted pink, got the typical sleeves markings, and the 40mm Vulcan gun was upgunned to a 6-barreled Gatling gun. Something that didn't just increase its firepower, but also its sensor range thanks to the powerful sensor that was installed on the gun. And this thing was supposedly taken from a Gaza series mobile suit. Still, this did do little to increase their overall combat performance, and they were almost exclusively relegated to patrol duties and reconnaissance missions, which is probably why they got that giant sensor unit on their Gatling gun. But hey, if you're a Zeon Remnant, you gotta make do with what you've got, so we've also got a slightly more powerful version of the Dra-C, which was also deployed during the Lost conflict, the Dra-C Custom. It was almost identical to the base version, but it came with 2 Zaku arms instead of the 1 arm 1 Vulcan combo pack, meaning that it could also use standard Zaku weaponry. And it had more powerful thruster pods, which were modified from a space assault craft. While these did give the Dra-C Custom higher acceleration, it did decrease its maneuverability. Also, since it seems like these were supposed to be the superior machine, I'd like to imagine that the Dra-C Customs were made with better spare parts than the standard Dra-C. Like, they got old stock and replacement parts, whereas the standard Dra-C was made with parts from damaged Zaku's and damaged Gattles. But whatever the case might be, some of these Dra-C Customs would also go on to survive the Lost conflict and ended up in Axis hands, where they would be further customized into the Dra-C Custom Heavy Equipment type. And as the name indicates, this is simply the Dra-C Custom, but with more weapons. It got a handheld Gatling gun, 2 Sturmfausts mounted on the shield, and 4 rocket pods mounted onto the boosters. This did of course slightly decrease its maneuverability, but I'm sure that this firepower was a worthy trade-off. And it seems that these were actually meant as combat units, as they would be used as escorts for the Regelk. And then finally, to wrap up this video, we go back to the Gattle with one final variant that appeared in the Zero's old Zaku manga. This Gattle was outfitted with a manipulator arm and was called the Gattle Workboat Specification. And that has been all for the development history of the Dra-C and the funky space fighters that made it possible. They never really got their chance to shine, especially in the case of the Dra-C, but they did all fulfill important roles in their own way. If you ever find yourself piloting one of these though, you'd better make sure your life insurance is up to date and hope that isekais are real. So as always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.